There are two real kind of main types of planning when we talk about ERP systems and MRP specifically. So we have demand-driven planning, which is kind of that pull method that we've talked about before. You produce based on a demand that you have in your system, and you need to fulfill that demand with supply of some sort, either through planned purchase orders or production orders or transfer orders or some kind of way that you're going to get that demand fulfilled. We also have supply constrained planning. This is when you have a supply that may be fixed and not easily replaceable. Therefore, you're going to produce what you can when you can, and our end products are then pushed through the production process and up to the retailers. So, what does that mean? In demand driven planning, we get our demand in, which is typically in a sales order. It could be some other kind of order in the system, but something that's driving that demand is coming into our system. Once that demand comes in, we're going to execute planning. Once planning is executed, we're going to take that planned order and we're going to throw it into production. We're going to go through the production life cycle and then we're going to deliver that product. Pretty straightforward. This is a lot of what our manufactured goods are used to is a demand-driven planning. But what if we're constrained by supply? What if we are limited in what we can do based on the supply that we have coming in? Well, in that situation, it's almost exactly the same, except those first two steps really aren't necessary, right? We're not really taking demand into account. We're not technically going to run any kind of planning to match our demand with planned supply. In supply constraint planning, we're really just planning production as we have raw materials available. And once those raw materials are available, we execute our planning life cycle or our production life cycle, and then that product is going to be delivered after that. So with that being said, does MRP have a use in supply constrained manufacturing? You might be thinking, well, if I'm just producing what I have available to me, do I really need to take into account MRP, or is there a use for MRP? And the answer is yes. There's always going to be some kind of a need for MRP or some basic planning in your organization, especially if you're using or if you are supply constrained. You might want to start to consider using supply forecasting. And we're going to talk about forecasting in a little bit here, but there is still the opportunity to use MRP. So let's take a scenario here. We're going to look at an ethanol plant, and barring some kind of miracle, and being able to plant, grow, and harvest an entire crop in the span of a few days, ethanol plants sometimes have to look to outside resources. While they would typically just produce what they have and distribute those finished goods from there, if they run out of a raw material, so in this instance, corn, it could mean an opportunity and a real cost to shut down that facility. If we have to shut down the facility, or if we are going to run out of the raw material to keep it running, I've seen in some instances where it could take 3 days to restart the plant, potentially costing us idle time and resources. We may want to utilize MRP in this scenario to plan ahead and potentially buy more of that raw material. So buy more corn from another producer in order to keep our plant operational. MRP can help in this scenario by keeping an eye on our inventory levels, along with the lead times that we have in the system, and generate either planned purchase orders, planned production orders, some kind of planned order for our commodity buyers to go out and purchase additional corn or other raw materials that we need in order to keep that facility operational. So let's take a look at Dynamics 365's net requirements form here. So in this form, we're just looking at the net requirements of all of our supply matched up with our demand. I have my raw material here, which is corn, and I see that I have 10,000 on hand. So right now, I have 10,000 bushels on hand, and that's going to exhaust all of my raw material supply based off this one bomb line that I have that's coming due, it looks like tomorrow. So I have a bomb line coming up. I'm going to produce uh, uh, some ethanol tomorrow, and I need 10,000 bushels of corn in order to produce that. However, that's going to exhaust all of my raw material supply. And you can see here, my next shipment of corn or raw material into my production facility is not planned until Friday. So I'm getting 20,000 bushels on Friday, which will meet my production requirements for both the bomb line that's coming up on Thursday and the one that's coming up on Friday. However, there is going to be a day of idle time in between there. And this is just kind of a real quick example here, but it could be, days between our next shipment of raw material and the raw material that I have on hand in order to produce those. So this is an example where we're not necessarily going to go out and be able to say, hey, we need to grow, a lot more corn in the next couple of weeks here, but it can give us a signal to our commodity buyers that, hey, we need to go out and we need to look at additional raw materials in order to make sure that we keep our plant running. Now, you may be wondering, what if we don't necessarily fall strictly into a single category? We do have the ability in MRP to be flexible and account for this hybrid approach where you might not fall into necessarily supply constrained or demand driven, but there might be kind of a combination of the two. And an example of that, let's say that we have our supply constrained commodities, but we still have packaging material. So in the hybrid approach, our supply constrained commodities can either be excluded from the planning runs, or we can still include them in the planning runs so we get those net requirements facilitated for us. However, we can set up our items like our packaging materials and anything else that's demand driven to still be planned by demand. So we can still have these planned purchase orders being generated for our packaging materials or anything else that might happen to be a demand driven component. And that demand can be driven by the batch production itself. So if we're using supply constrained commodities and we just have batch orders that are going through the system at a regular pace, we don't necessarily need to create any other kind of demand for that. That batch production process is our demand signal that we do need to purchase those additional packaging materials. So let's take another scenario. Let's take a look at a grain milling scenario in this case. Similar to our ethanol plants, when we're talking about grain milling, we have the same problem. Our wheat or our other commodities is a supply constrained raw material. However, we still need to plan for the packaging materials that we need. And we can plan based on the production that's currently scheduled as a demand. So all of our current production that's in process can be used as that demand signal. And as a bonus, because we are utilizing master planning in this scenario, we can run hypotheticals or easily turn on planning for that commodity item to simulate when we might need to purchase or generate planned orders for that commodity. So we're getting the benefit of the supply constrained planning that we talked about in the ethanol scenario, whether or not we're going to actually act on those planned orders that get generated for us. Now, how do we take into account some of our resource constraints? We're talking about the raw material items right now, but resource constraints can also be a part of this supply constrained process. Now, the good news is resource constraints are a standard part of the route setup within our ERP systems, and especially within Dynamics 365. The resource setup itself allows us to specify whether or not we have what we call a bottleneck resource. We can also specify our efficiency percentage and the amount of time each operation takes in order to complete. And what this is going to do is it's going to give us a better accounting or a better scenario where we're able to see where we are running into those bottlenecks throughout the process. So in D365, you can see here that we do have, I just pulled up a real basic example of a resource here. But within this resource, we're able to define our finite capacity. We're able to define what our efficiency percentage is. So if we have an older machine that maybe doesn't process things as well as it used to, but it's still able to process our milling or our ethanol or whatever we have, we can still utilize that resource, and we can just define that, hey, this is maybe running at about 70% efficiency now. We can also specify what the runtime is. So not only can we get a good view of what this resource is and what this resource has to offer us, but we can specify how long it's going to take for it to run. And as a part of our route process, this is going to help with not only scheduling, but also planning and our capacity planning that we have to take into account when we're talking about all of our supply constraints. So how can we get a more precise estimate of our projected volumes? So we've talked about the current production process and looking in short term ahead, but how can we get a more precise estimate of these projected volumes that we might have? And the answer to that is forecasts. Forecasts are the tool that we have that gives us the ability to predict the future, right? Forecasting is kind of a way that we can take our historical data that we have in the system or any system, plus any external data that we want to feed into the system. So if we want to talk about historical yields, we want to talk about our long-term weather forecasts, drought conditions, all of those factors can be translated into the forecast, where we can then utilize algorithms to predict what our supply and what our demand are going to be for a coming period. Now, a supply forecast in this scenario is our tool that's going to help us forecast the supply based on historical data, whereas our demand forecast is going to be the tool that we use to help forecast the demand for that historical data. Both are supported features within D365 and a lot of other ERP systems, but mostly within D365 and Leverage. And the really cool thing about the way that D365 handles these supply and demand forecasts is MRP can treat the supply forecast as supply when it's calculating its requirements for the coming period, and it can treat those demand forecasts as demand during its calculation. So it's almost like a simulated supply and demand, so that we can utilize the forecast to help generate what we're going to do for the coming week or 2 weeks or however long we run MRP out, whatever our coverage time fence is for that. Now, luckily, D365 does have a great tool to help us with these forecasts. And the great news is, if you ever looked at the D365 forecasting tool in the past, you almost needed to be a data scientist to extract the data out or to give it additional data besides the historical data. With this new demand forecasting tool, or this demand planning tool, I should say, you don't necessarily need to be a data scientist in order to get these quality forecasts. And as an added bonus, we also have the ability for Copilot to give these forecasts some extra horsepower. So let's take a look at our Demand Planner app. So the Demand Planner tool allows us to feed in all of our historical information. So all of our historical sales and our historical inventory levels from Dynamics, plus any additional context that we want to translate into time series data. I've seen weather translated into time series data. You could also utilize your historical yields. You could utilize the Old Farmer's Almanac if you want to feed in drought conditions or anything like that, to kind of help you figure out what your supply and what your demand are going to be. Once you have that information in the Demand Planner app, there are 3 algorithms that give you the ability to plan based off of the inputs that we've given it. And those algorithms can give you the insights into predicted demand for any upcoming period that you define. So if you want to define your demand for the next year or 2 years or 3 years, you can do that. You can define however long into the future you want to go. This is a valuable insight that can help guide your purchasing and production decisions. Plus, again, the demand planning app also incorporates the power of Copilot now. So, Copilot in the demand planning app gives us the ability to interact with the data without having to be a data scientist to understand what's being presented. You can take the data that is presented in the demand planning app and you can ask it real conversational questions, and Copilot will reply with real conversational answers, citing the data in an easier to consume form. You can also utilize Copilot to look outside of your historical demand or any data that we fed it, and ask Copilot if there's any outside influences that are perhaps shaping why things are a certain way within our demand forecast. So, with all of that data presented, what are our next steps? So, first of all, if you're not already, take advantage of the built-in planning engine where it makes sense. There may be some raw materials or some commodities in your environment or in your company that don't necessarily make sense to have MRP run for, but chances are, even in a supply constrained environment, master planning can help give you those net requirements so that you can see out into the future when you're going to exhaust your supply. You also should be setting up your system to take into account those bottleneck resources. So any resources that you have in D365 that are maybe a little bit less on the efficiency, maybe a bottleneck resource in your process, make sure that your system is set up to take those into account. Also, if you haven't already looked at it, consider utilizing the demand planning functionality to help get more precise extended planning. And again, like we talked about, that demand plan or that demand forecast can actually help to guide our MRP and allow us to view kind of that simulated demand or that simulated supply in the future. And again, if you have any questions with any of this or you want some additional help, contact Stone Ridge Software. We'd be happy to help with all of these and more.